Hello students, and welcome back to the second session of this series of development of blood vessels. In the last session, we read about the general development of blood vessels, and we also talked about how many arch arteries are there and how they have developed. So now we will start from there, and in this part 2 of this series, we will talk about specifically about the fate of arch arteries, and then we will move to the third arch artery fate specifically. So let us move further and let us see what happens to the various arch arteries. We had known that there are 5 arch arteries: first, second, third, fourth and sixth. Why not the fifth? Because the fifth disappears as soon as it appears along with the disappearing arch. So we will see what happens to the remaining 5 arch arteries. See, if we have a look at this picture, from now on we will be focusing on this picture, and if you understand this picture well, then believe me, you will be able to decode and you will be able to explain yourself how the various arteries develop, because I understand that this topic is a very difficult topic, and usually if you start mugging up, it is almost impossible. So lay focus only on this figure, and if you keep this picture in your mind, I can promise that you can easily decode how various arch arteries develop and what they give rise to. So broadly remember that from this framework that we have formed till now, some parts of the arch arteries will completely disappear and others will remain. So this whole framework will not remain, some parts will disappear and some parts will remain, and the remaining parts will form the arteries of head and neck. So by the end of this series, you will find it very interesting actually, this topic. So let us see in a table form what is the fate of the arch arteries. See what happens to the first arch artery. Largely the greater part of this artery disappears. There is only one remnant, and that is the maxillary artery. So have you seen the maxillary artery? We have seen it in the infratemporal fossa, and this is the main artery of the infratemporal fossa. So we always remember branches of maxillary artery. We will try to remember the branches of mandibular nerve. But if somebody randomly asks us in the viva, how does the maxillary artery develop? Majority of the students will get stuck up because they are not able to correlate arch arteries with the gross part. So always remember to correlate embryological knowledge with the gross knowledge, and then if you are not finding any answer to a gross question, believe me, the answer you will find in embryology. So this is an example of that type of questions. How does the maxillary artery develop? It is a remnant of first arch artery. Now what is the fate of second arch artery? See, second arch artery, larger part again disappears, and there are 2 remnants. The first remnant is the hyoid artery and the second remnant is the stapedial arteries. Now this becomes again a very important question, because randomly somebody may ask you, how does the hyoid artery develop? This again seems to be, most of the students will say, sir or ma'am, we haven't read it. But that is not the fact, you have read it, but where? In the embryology. So hyoid artery is the remnant of second arch artery, and stapedial arteries are remnants again of the second arch artery. So remember these arteries which we read about rarely, but they become important questions, because we also want to understand how much you are correlating things. Now let us see about the fate of third and fourth arch arteries. See, these arteries are very important because they will not disappear, they will form major arteries in the body. Similar is for the sixth arch artery, that is why I have kept them together. But before we move further, we will have to understand that the third and the fourth arch artery will open into the ventral part of the aortic sac, and the sixth arch arteries will open into the dorsal part of the aortic sac. But where does this come from? Because till now we have only seen that the ventral aorta will fuse together to form the aortic sac, and the unfused part will form the right and the left horns. So till now we haven't seen the division of the aortic sac, but we also know that the distalmost part of the heart tube, the truncus arteriosus part, there is a development of a septum in it, and this septum will further move up, because we know that the aortic sac has joined the fused heart tube. So, the septum forming in the heart tube will go up and will also divide the aortic sac into two parts, the ventral part and the dorsal part. So, now aortic sac has two parts in it. The third and the fourth arch arteries will open into the ventral part and the sixth arch artery will open into the dorsal part. So, I think this must be clear by now. Now, let us see what happens. Further changes. The first step is important. As you can see in the figure, the first figure shows dotted lines. These dotted lines show that major parts of the first artery and the second artery have disappeared, and we know the remnants now. So, the remnant of first arch artery is, let us revise again, maxillary artery, and the remnants of second arch artery are hyoid and stapedial artery. So, those two arches have been shown with dotted lines, but we can see clearly the third arch artery, the fourth arch artery and the sixth. So, where is the fifth? The fifth has disappeared. So, focus on third, fourth and sixth. But we can see some portion of the dorsal aorta is extending beyond the third arch artery. This part of the dorsal aorta will not disappear, it will remain. So, the two dorsal aortae, they grow beyond the point of attachment of first arch artery, and this becomes important. Again, another thing which happens is the part of the dorsal aortae between the third and the fourth arch artery. So, focus on the second figure, and here if I click, you can see this area. This is the part of the dorsal aorta lying between the third and the fourth arch arteries. This part disappears. We can see on both the sides this region has disappeared, and this will be known as ductus caroticus or carotid duct. Ductus caroticus or carotid duct. This part will disappear on both the sides, and this area specifically is known as ductus caroticus. So, these two things have happened, further changes which have happened in the arch arteries. Another point, note this arrow. If you compare the two figures, in the first figure we can see this part of the dorsal aorta was there, but in this figure we can see where the arrow lies, this part has disappeared. So, the right dorsal aorta disappears below the fourth arch artery. Now, whatever is the remaining framework, so first arch artery has disappeared, larger part, second arch artery has disappeared, larger part. We can see the disappearance of the dorsal aorta between the third and the fourth arch arteries, and we can see the disappearance of the right dorsal aorta below the attachment of fourth arch artery. So, once all these parts have disappeared, whatever remains will now form the major arteries of our body, and let us see how they will form. Focusing on the third arch artery first, because we will proceed from third, the fourth and sixth. So, now focus on the red arrows that come now in the figures. So, what happens to the third arch arteries? See, the third arch artery will give off a bud. It is a separate bud arising from the third arch artery. This bud will form the external carotid artery. Now, the part of third arch artery up to the attachment of this bud, that means this area, the part of the third arch artery up to the attachment of this offshoot or bud will form the common carotid artery. And if we move to the next step, now focus on the part of third arch artery distal to the attachment of this bud. So, if we keep this bud in mind, there is a part proximal to it and there is a part distal to it. So, part of the third arch artery proximal to the bud and the part of the third arch artery distal to the bud. As we know, the bud itself will form the external carotid, the part of the third arch artery proximal to the bud will form the common carotid, and the part of third arch artery distal to this attachment along with the part of dorsal aorta beyond the attachment of third arch, they will form the internal carotid artery. So, I hope we have understood that this third arch artery is largely forming the carotid system of arteries. So, whenever a random question is asked, what are the derivatives of third arch? As soon as a third arch, you hear third arch, automatically carotid system should come in your mind, and then you should be able to explain which part of this third arch artery will give rise to common carotid, which will give rise to external carotid, and which parts along with the dorsal aorta will give rise to the internal carotid. So, I think this explains the carotid system, especially the third arch artery. Now, additional thing which happens here is 7th cervical intersegmental artery supplying the upper limb bud will attach to the dorsal aorta opposite the attachment of 4th arch artery. To understand it, let us have a look at this figure and this arrow. See, compare the left and the right figures. In the first figure, we do not see any such artery joining the arch arteries. But on the right side, we can see additional artery has joined this system specifically at the area where the 4th arch artery was joining. So, this is another new step. Now, what are these intersegmental arteries? See, intersegmental arteries supply various regions of the body, but here we are specifically talking about the intersegmental artery supplying the upper limb. 7th cervical intersegmental artery supplying the upper limb. So, this becomes important. How it becomes important, we will talk about it later on. But as of now, just understand that this is attaching opposite to the attachment of the 4th arch artery. So, with these points, now we have a stable platform. In this particular session, we have learnt about largely the fate of different arches and in detail the fate of the third aortic arch. So, in the next session, we will move further and talk about other arteries which develop from the remaining arches. So, thank you very much and meet you in the next session.